Ahoy, how are you? Are you well? It's so nice to see you. Thank you for coming to this talk. It's going to be wonderful. My name is Juliet Russell. It's my 4th time at Melting Pot Forum and in Ostrava, and every time is very special, so thank you for always creating such a lovely environment and so many interesting things to listen to see, and to experience. So in the UK, I'm from London, and I work in the music industry, but alongside a woman named Helen Bagnall, we set up events where we discuss ideas, one called Salon London and another called Also Festival. So we're very happy to be a partner here in Melting Pot Forum. So I'm delighted to introduce you to this talk about who does our brain think we are. And actually the talk is about how we're lucky enough to have Cathrine Loveday with us, who is a neuroscientist. But actually the talk really has a focus on memory, because actually memory really plays such a key part in forming our identity. But I'm going to introduce you to Cathrine first. So Professor Cathrine Loveday is a neuroscientist, an author, and a lecturer. She lectures in cognitive and clinical neuroscience and psychology at the University of Westminster in London. And Cathrine has a specialist interest in memory, working closely with people with impaired memories or memory loss, with a view to improving their quality of life, but also for us, helping us to understand the role that our memory plays within our brains and within our relationships, within our identity, and within our cultural identity. And Cathrine is a brilliant science communicator. She's very, very dedicated, and not only doing the research and writing research papers, but to going out there, attending events like this, talking to people about how we can look at improving memory as a lifelong skill, and curating it as we age. So for lots of us, we may have family members who have experience dementia or Alzheimer's, that kind of thing. So how you can safeguard against things like that, but also how you can really work with your own memories to think about what's important to you, but also to create your own identity, and what parts of your life really help with that. We're going to be talking about that. Cathrine is highly collaborative. She works on a lot of projects across disciplines. She also has a very special interest in music as a musician herself, so that often comes into play in her work. So she's done a lot of talks around music, but also music and memory, and some of the facets of life that we experience that really build our identity. So please give a huge, warm, melting pot welcome to the wonderful Professor Cathrine Loveday. Hi, Cathrine.
Thank you so much.
So lovely to have you here. Thank you. So Cathrine, I know you work closely with people with impaired memories or with really quite profound memory loss. And what is it in studying where memory has been impaired? What does that teach us about our human identity and memory in our own lives?
Yeah, well, I will start by telling you the story of Claire. So Claire is a lady in her sort of late 50s, and at the age of 40, she had a viral encephalitis, which is an infection of the brain. And she survived. She was treated well, and she came home from hospital, but most of her memories had been erased. So she didn't remember any of her children being born. She had 4 children, didn't remember any of them being born, didn't remember any of the life she'd had with them. She couldn't really remember anything that she'd done before the age of about 5 or 6. So she had a few sort of just fleeting childhood memories, and maybe, a few things in her teens, but most of her memories, recollective kind of memories, had gone. And she came back to her house, and she says she didn't even recognize her home, she didn't recognize the house, she didn't recognize any of her family. And she has had to rebuild her life. I think meeting her, the most extraordinary thing was that she's still an incredibly intelligent person. And what's really striking is that when you spend time with her, initially you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know anything was wrong. She's got this amazing capacity to cover it up. But it is utterly, utterly profound. So I could spend time with her doing things. So she's not just lost her memory for the past, she also can't make new memories. So I can spend a whole day with her doing really exciting things. I can meet up with her a week later, and she will have absolutely no recollection of any of that having happened. So really within a day or two, her memories are wiped. And so what I learned from her is that identity, you know, is a very, very complex thing, and that there are ways in which her identity didn't change, and there are aspects of her and her personality that remained really stable. But her sense of being a mum, you know, and she was a nurse, all of these things were really destroyed by the fact that she didn't remember any of those things happening. I mean, how do you define yourself as a mother if you can't remember having spent any time with your children or giving birth to them?
So, two things. One is, obviously, aspects of her memory were retained because she retained her linguistic capabilities and all those kind of things. So what was different about Claire's brain? What had happened in this sort of amnesia event?
So Claire had a lot of damage to an area called the hippocampus, which is a really important structure for both making memories and being able to retrieve memories. There was also some damage in the prefrontal cortex, which we know is very important for sort of organizing memories and allowing us to search through memories. There was also damage to an area of the brain called the fusiform gyrus, which allows you to recognize faces. So she had completely lost her ability to recognize faces, to the point that she couldn't recognize, she can't even sometimes recognize gender or ethnicity or anything. She would even sometimes see a photograph of a cat and think that that was a human. But what is really interesting about Claire is the aspects of her memory that still work. So she is still able to have knowledge about her life. Now, this may sound weird. When I say she has no memories, what I mean is she cannot recollect stuff ever having happened to her. But she knows that she's a mother. She knows that she's a nurse. She knows where she lives. She knows what the names of her children are. And there's this real misconception in film work that somebody can develop an amnesia and forgets who they are. And that just doesn't really happen in an organic sort of amnesia like Claire had. So she still knows who she is, and she still has all this information about her life, and she's been able to relearn information about her life. And to give you a sense of what some of this is like, if you imagine, well, I guess most of you will know something from your past that you don't remember. So the example I always use is that I know I went to Switzerland when I was 6 months old. I've seen all the photos. I know that I went there, but I don't remember going. I was only 6 months old. So I can have that knowledge without having the memory. And that's what Claire has. She has this semantic knowledge. So the areas of her brain that store knowledge have to some extent been preserved. She's also able to have feelings. So she still has reactions and emotional responses to things, and she is still affected by things that have happened to her in the past. So again, another way to think about this is if sometimes you might wake up from a dream, and you might wake up from the dream and think, I'm absolutely going to remember every part of that. It was a really vivid dream. It was really exciting, something very emotional maybe. And you can really believe that that's going to happen. And then 10 minutes later, I hope this isn't just me, but 10 minutes later, you can kind of think, oh, do you know what? It's kind of going already. And by an hour later, it can have completely gone. But then maybe something in your environment maybe might trigger a part of that, and you can't quite put it back together again. And really, having spent a lot of time with Claire, this is what she seems to do. So she can have knowledge about her life. But the other thing about these dreams is that you can sometimes maintain the emotion. So you might forget the dream, but still carry that emotion. And I think we have this sort of belief that if you don't remember it, somehow it's not going to impact on you. And actually, Claire carries her history in her, and she has to rely very heavily on intuition. Somebody can come up to her and tell them that they are her husband. She is not going to know just by looking at them whether that person is her husband or not. But her intuition can sometimes tell her, because her implicit, unconscious memory system is completely intact.
And I remember you recounting an experience where she doesn't know her children are her children, or didn't know that in a cognitive way, but she knew that she loved the people that she was around. So she still had that feeling. So what I'm hearing is there's things like embodied memory, and that memory actually is incredibly complex. So there's a number of ways that or forms that memory takes, but also that it happens in multiple regions in the brain.
That's right. I mean, I think of memory as being any way in which your past imprints on how you behave now and how you feel now. Mm-hmm. And some of that will be stuff that we can consciously recollect. But much of it will be stored in other ways. Even, for example, learning how to walk or drive or ride a bike. You know, those become part of who we are, but we don't necessarily remember doing any of those things.
Yeah, and they become so integrated in our sort of daily lives that they're no longer something we have to recall to do, because they're sort of things we're practicing regularly. So in terms of the reliability of memory, so obviously for someone like Claire who's had their memory wiped, she doesn't have a reliable memory because she doesn't have anything to go on. But what about ourselves and our own reliability on our own memories? So the work that I've mainly done has been looking at autobiographical memory. So autobiographical memory is really our narrative, our story for our life, being able to go back in time and remember things that we've done. And that is constructed from the kind of knowledge I talked about, but also from the sights and the sounds and the feelings and the thoughts and the smells and all of those things that we kind of pull together with our knowledge to create a remembered experience. And the important thing to know about memory is that it's always a reconstruction. So we're always piecing it together anew every single time. We construct it in our mind. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like we're just thinking back to something and that we're just kind of reliving it. But actually what the brain is doing is to construct from those building blocks this remembered experience. Now, what is interesting is that for most of us, those memories are flexible, and they are necessarily flexible. We want them to be flexible because they allow us to adapt and change in response to who we are and in response to our environment and so on. So autobiographical memories are not that reliable. Usually the gist will be correct, and usually some of the details will be correct, but we can reconstruct them differently every time. And what happens in the brain is that the brain preserves elements of that experience that are important to us and that we relate to, and it kind of lets go. It doesn't rehearse. It just lets go of the bits that are not important. So two people can have a shared experience, but remember it really quite differently because different people have preserved different elements of what happened. And we can even have entirely false memories. And there's a huge body of research that has shown that we can implant false memories. We can show people pictures of things that didn't happen, and you can go back to them a week later and they will tell you in great detail about that memory that we have completely sort of made up. And the interesting thing, I always say that this flexibility of memory is really, really important in terms of our identity. And one of the problems with Claire is that she doesn't have a flexible memory. And what you see with people that have got memory loss is she can't reconstruct it. She has learned it almost like a script. So she can tell you about things that have happened to her in the past, but she's learned it like a script, and it never, ever changes, which is not what happens to most of us. There's a few things in there. So one thing I'm hearing is that actually we're incredibly vulnerable to misinformation because things can be said to us in certain ways that become believable to us. That also our memory, with a little bit of distance, like you said about the having a dream and then you're trying to remember it and then you can't. I remember when I was little, I used to try and be someone, like take a snapshot of it in my brain. I think like the curtains have got this pattern on, the smell is this, so I could really like, and I can only recall 2 now, but I had about 6 at the time. But also that that flexibility is important, but it means we're slightly lying to ourselves because something might have happened a certain way, but maybe we've evolved a bit and it doesn't quite fit in to how we now perceive ourselves.
I think that's true. I don't think we're actively lying to ourselves, but we have reconstructed a truth that maybe suits who we are. And most memory psychologists would say that's a really good thing to do. Every now and again, in a forensic setting, if you've been the eyewitness to a crime, then it really matters that you get every detail right. But for most of the time, those details don't matter. What matters is that the experiences that we remember support us in kind of going through life and being who we are.
Thank you, that's really good. Shu, is there any way we can look at our autobiographical memory?
Yeah, should we let's have a little go at doing this with the audience. Okay. So I'm going to, and this is going to be interesting in a multilingual audience, so we'll try this. I'm going to give you a word, and what I'd like you to do is to yourself, think about the first memory that comes to mind. Now, in our experiments, what we do is we ask people to be really specific, not just, oh, I used to do this, or there were times when I used to do that, but a kind of moment, an absolute, sort of a particular specific moment in your life that is triggered by the word. Now, it won't happen for everybody. Some people won't be able to think of something, but let's just try it. So the word is bicycle.
So if anyone wants to say that in Czech for us, that would be amazing.
Oh, no, don't say it
No,
yet.
not yet. Oh, sorry. Do not do that. Apologies.
Okay, so
Sorry.
Can you put your hands up if you have got a memory for the word bicycle? Okay, there's lots of people with memories that have come to mind. Okay, let's just try something. Can you tell me, if you think about roughly how old you were when that happened, can you tell me if you were under the age of 5? Okay, a couple. 5 to 10? 10 to 15? 15 to 20? 20 to 30? Over 30? Okay, I should have said, by the way, that they're not allowed to be within the last week. That's the other thing that we say. Okay, now let's just try it in Czech. Let's see if anything is different. Can someone give us the word for bicycle in Czech?
I can come with my microphone if anyone knows it over here.
Lots of people are saying it, but I can't.
Kolof. Is that right?
Kolof. Okay.
Kolof.
Can you now tell me, those of you who speak Czech, can you tell me whether a different memory comes to mind? Did anyone get a different memory, or have I tainted it now? No one different.
That was my fault for giving it away.
There was one. So one of the things we found, I'm going to just, there's a couple of things to say about what happened with people putting their hands up. So the first thing to say about Czech, the reason I ask that is that when we test people in different languages, we get different results. People tend to recall things from different times in their life, depending on the words that we use and the language we use. So we have found one guy, for example, who speaks 4 languages, and the results are different for each of the 4 languages. But what was really interesting then is that most people now, we've got a range of ages in here, but, most people are over 20 in here, quite a few are over 30, some are definitely over 40. But most hands went up in childhood, sort of 5 to 10, 10 to 15. And this is kind of what we see in our research. So we tend to see that if you give people, I think the list we use is 24 words long, that people don't tend to just choose memories from across their lifespan. You would think that maybe they would be kind of just spread across your life, or that they might be the most recent memories, but that's not what we find. People are sometimes likely to come up with recent memories, and we definitely had a few recent memories. But by and large, we tend to kind of recall spontaneously older memories. And in particular, we recall memories from between the ages of usually around 10 and 30 is where the peak happens. So we can test people in lots of different ways, but we find that those memories tend to be the ones that are most powerful. It does depend what words you use, it does depend what language you use, but by and large, we can find that effect really, really powerfully. And that we call that the reminiscence bump. And even when people get into old age, those memories tend to be the ones that are most solid and most robust. And even when people have memory loss, for example, things like dementia, they will be able to go back to those memories because they seem to be the ones that are most strongly burnt into the brain and most easily remembered.
So that, I know there's another word for that, another phrase for that, which is our self-defining period, which is our other word for the reminiscence bump, or phrase for it. What are the reasons for that? Why is that the period of time where we seem so much more attuned to our memories?
So there's a number of different theories about why we have this reminiscence bump, and as you say, it has been described as a self-defining period for reasons that I'll explain in a second. One possibility, the most likely one you might argue, is that our brains are just at their best at that point. And we know that to some extent that's true. We know that the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex that are really sort of play a central role in creating these memories are really coordinated, they are well developed, and they function really, really well at that time. So that's one possibility, but it doesn't explain other results we have. It doesn't explain that sometimes you can go to a particular cultural group and they will have a second bump, like the entire group will show these sort of second bumps. And it doesn't explain the fact that it can move slightly, it can shift in people when, depending on how you test it. So other theories are, we do lots of new things, there's lots of novelty, we do things for the first time. And we also have lots of important emotions at that time. So another thought is that, well, it's a really quite emotional time in our life and we tend to remember emotional events. But the theory that all of these things are probably true, and it's probably a combination of these, but the final theory, which I think is particularly relevant to this session and which a lot of our work has supported, is that those memories are really central to our identity. So we have experiences at that time that kind of define who we are and how and who we're going to be. So we make decisions about what kind of work we want to do, what kind of job we want to have, where we want to live, who we want to spend our life with, what we believe about things. So we have these very kind of life-changing epiphanies and moments that occur at that time in our life. And we return to them over and over again because they reinforce our sense of who we are. And I could demonstrate this with you, maybe.
Yeah, let's do that. I would love to do that. This is going to be the next thing. And I'm just curious as to, because we're moving away from that kind of parental relationship where we've been kind of almost given, seeing our template for how to live around our parents. And as we start to get a bit older and get more independent, we're forming our own identity. So that formation of it is part of the reason for that reminiscence bump.
Yes, absolutely. So this fits with work from developmental psychologists that show that this time is really, really important in terms of developing and forming our identity. And so memory psychologists have argued that, including myself, that this is why we've reinforced those memories, because they reinforce our sense of identity.
Perfect, but let's do our
Okay, so let's just try this. Yeah. And I will try it on Juliet, but you can try doing it in your mind at the same time. And this is based on an experiment that we've done several times, and I'm going to do the simplified version of it here. So what we do is we say to people, complete this sentence, and if you just complete it in your mind, I am a... Okay, so what's yours?
A singer.
I am a singer. Okay, so you might have come up with different things. Now what I'd like you to do, and again, the rest of you can try and do this, is to hold that sentence in your mind. I am a singer. Think of yourself as a singer. Now do that same thing and trying to think about any memories that just jump into your mind when you say that sentence to yourself. Are people able to do this? How many people had an I am? Did most people manage to get an I am? Are you getting memories coming to mind just out of interest? Yes, okay. Juliet, have you got some memories?
Yeah, I've got 3. 2 came quickly and then 1 came a little later.
Okay, so we try to get people, well, we've done it with up to 10, but we've found that we only really need to get people to do 3 memories for this to work. So sometimes it takes people a little longer. We're kind of on the stage now, so I'm putting people under pressure to do it quickly. But you can try this. Try this on your friends, by the way, and your family. It's really revealing. You learn so much about people when you do this. So we're about to learn about you, Juliet.
Okay.
So you said, I am a singer.
Yeah.
Can you had 3 memories. Can you mentally put those in time order? So which of those events that you've remembered is the earliest?
The earliest is when I was probably 8 or 9. And there's a big square in London called Trafalgar Square, and there was a painting competition. And I was too shy to go and paint and do this competition. And it's for kids, for young people. And my dad said to me, how will you ever be a singer when you're too shy to do a painting? So I was like, okay. So I did the painting, and it was just flowers in a vase. And I won a prize. So that was like a really,
So that's what we would call a self-defining memory. So these are the memories that we look at that was a really pivotal point for you, because essentially what your dad had said is, you kind of need to pass this test, you need to take this action, you need to do this thing if you're going to prove that you can be a singer. So that moment was a really important moment for you. So you've got memories. How many memories must you have of singing? I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of memories of singing. And yet, when I ask you to come up with the first ones that come to mind, you've chosen a memory of when you were 10 years old and painting on a pavement. And this is a really good example of what we see in the research. People remember really events that seem, arguably quite trivial, but which are really, really important in terms of our sense of self. And we haven't got time to look at the others now, but you find quite often when people, very often the earliest memory when people just do 3 will be a critical point, like a decision point or a moment where something happened. Just out of interest, did that happen for anybody else? You put your hand up if that happened for you. There's a few out there. Try doing this, with somebody else at some point, and you will see that you find out things about people. I've just found out something about you. Yeah. But these self-defining memories occur a lot in our research, and as you know, we've looked at memories in relation to music. Yeah. And we have a radio program called Desert Island Discs in the UK, where celebrities come on and they choose 8 songs that they would take with them to a desert island. And this is a really revealing question to ask people. You find out a bit about their music taste, but you find out much more about them, because when you ask people to choose 8 songs, the songs are interesting, but what's really interesting is why they've chosen to take them. And there's lots that we could talk about there, but the thing to focus on is that we see a lot of these self-defining memories. So Bruce Springsteen, for example, had 8 songs that he could take with him to a desert island, and 3 of those songs were songs that reminded him of a really kind of important moment where he became a guitarist. So he describes one moment where he chose a song that took him back to a time where he was in a cafe listening to things, and suddenly he heard the Beatles playing, and it made him want to become a guitarist. So he could take any songs with him to a desert island. He knows a lot of songs, I know that for sure. And he's chosen to take 8, of which 3 of them remind him of those moments in his life. So our argument is that those memories, those remembered experiences, are really, really important in terms of reinforcing and reaffirming our identity.
Wonderful. And it's also important to say that they are really important, but equally we can adapt our identity as we go through life, and different purposes or different functions in our life, or different roles that we play in our life, or different lives that we inhabit in the span of our lifetime.
Yeah, so I would argue that aspects of our identity are always growing and changing. That period that I've talked about, our adolescence, is particularly important in terms of identity formation. But you can become a husband or a wife, you can become a parent, you can take on a completely new job and have a career change. People often partially and sometimes wholly reinvent themselves. And my argument would be that those past memories still make up that identity, and some of those past memories are about really fundamental things about how you view life. And we're continually creating new identities. So when you look at different cultural groups, you will find that, for example, if there has been a big event, it's going to be really fascinating to see what happens with the pandemic, by the way, because several people have predicted that will drive another sort of bump. Yeah. But we've seen, if you take a group where there have been huge kind of wars, or particularly wars that are about sort of identity and nationalism and so on, that you see this kind of another peak. So they will have this peak in their memories, but they will also then have another peak later on for around the time that this happens. So we will still have other memories that reinforce our identity. It's just that when you look at a whole population, those will average out.
And it makes sense, doesn't it? Those kind of seismic events that are kind of once in a generation or once in a lifetime. I'd like to just tell the audience that we will be talking for about 10 more minutes, and then we will open up to questions for you, so please do think of your questions. There's a couple of things I'd like to ask you, and there's sort of three things I'd like to unpick from what you just said. One is, because we talked about autobiographical memory, there's also episodic memory, and there are other types of memory, because I know that how we create our identity and create our memories are quite complex. Could you talk to us about some of the differences and the reliability?
Yeah, so this relates a little bit to what I was saying with Claire, where she has different parts of her memory system that still work well. So when you learn how to walk or ride a bike, that's stored in the cerebellum, which is this bit at the back of the brain here. And episodic memory is really kind of means recollective, a sort of recollective experience. So Claire's episodic memory is very non-existent. She can't recollect stuff. But the sort of alternative to that, or the other side of our conscious memory, is semantic memory, which is our knowledge. So those two parts of the memory system are not entirely separate, but there is quite a distinction between them, and you can have one without the other. Mostly we use both of those. And then the other system that I talked about with Claire is this implicit memory system, which is kind of spread around much more of the brain, and it's stored in slightly different way. And this implicit memory system is really, really robust. So even young children have it, and even people with dementia have it. This capacity to for your past experiences to influence the way that you behave without you necessarily being aware of it. So you could have a strong phobia for spiders and never remember something that happened, but it may be that at some point earlier in your life something happened that created that phobia, and you end up with this fear that you carry forward.
Wonderful, thank you for explaining that. And the other thing we touched on, obviously, with Desert Islanders, and I know you're very knowledgeable about, is memory and music. And I know there's a kind of correlation between our reminiscence bump in terms of memory, but also in terms of our musical tastes.
Yeah, so time and time again, it doesn't matter how you look at memory, and it doesn't matter how you look at music. We see this same pattern. So yes, people are more likely, if you ask them for favorite songs, they're more likely to give you memories from around that time. But they're also better at recognizing songs from that time. But they also prefer and choose music from that time. And they're not necessarily the same thing. I'm sure everybody has a song that they recognize really quickly and know really well, but they absolutely hate. You know, it doesn't mean the same thing. And yet we see the same pattern with both of those. So people's preferences and their recognition of memory and the memories they have associated, all of those follow the same pattern. And they fit quite nicely with the theories around the reminiscence bump, because we know that sort of musical preference is quite tied up with identity, and also so is things like emotion. So music is very emotional. We use music a lot in our teenage years to help manage emotional situations. And therefore, that music becomes associated with quite powerful memories. But we've also been looking at other things other than music. So we've been looking at objects and photos and clothing and things like that.
Yeah, because I remember we were talking, my mum had Alzheimer's and she passed away from Alzheimer's, and we were talking yesterday, and both Cathrine and I have experience of parents with dementia, and we were talking yesterday about the things that it's important to have around people, even if they don't recognise it. So I was giving an example that my mum wore her coat when she went into residential care, and she went to wear her coat, and because it wasn't really appropriate to wear it inside, the staff took it from her, and we were talking about whether that's the right thing to do. And similarly, there was a statue, a little kind of figurine or small statue of a nurse, and my mum was a nurse. And even though she didn't obviously have an attachment to the object, it was always in her home. So for me, it was important to keep it there. But you talked about the scaffolding around memory, and I just wanted, if you could talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah,
future-proofing.
So hopefully what I've been able to kind of convey and get across to people is that these memories are very, very important in terms of us feeling like we are who we are. And they're important for our friendships, they're important for the decisions we make. And these things in our life play a really important role in supporting those memories. And that happens right at the neural level of things. So we know with memory and music, for example, that music and memory become structurally linked in the brain, so that you hear a piece of music and it structurally triggers the memory of something having happened in your life. But this is also likely to be happening with other things. So we look at a photo and that cues a memory. We hold an object in our hand and maybe we don't actually even look at the object. Maybe it's something tangible about holding it. And clothing, I think, is one of those things that is often considered almost as a trivial thing that doesn't really matter. But I think your mum's experience is really, really important. And I remember a lady that I was talking to whose dad had been evacuated during the war. So he'd been sent away from the city to a place in the country. And he had been given by his mother, age 6 or 7, a duffel coat. So a coat with these kind of buttons all the way down it. And he was in his 90s by this stage, and he still had this duffel coat. And whenever he didn't feel well, or whenever he was unhappy, he would reach for this duffel coat and put it over his bed. And that tells me something about the role of that. And we've also seen in, for example, people who go into care homes or hospitals or prisons, that often to separate them from their clothing can feel uncomfortable to them. And I'm sure, you know, some people will put on somebody else's jumper and it will feel great because it will make them feel that they're somehow sharing something. And sometimes it can feel really uncomfortable to put somebody else's clothing on. And we've seen in psychiatric institutions, for example, that people will come in and they will carry in a bag their clothes. And they often have medication that can make them put weight on, but they won't let go of this bag of clothes. It's really important to them. And it's because that clothing is something about their identity, and it's about the identity that they had when they came in, even down to the fact that they've physically changed shape now, but those clothes are the shape that they used to be. So it's not, you know, it cues those memories and supports those memories in so many different ways. And I always argue that it's really, really important as we go through life to try and work out what those things are that support our memory and think about how we can retain some connection with those things.
Yeah, beautiful, thank you. There's one other thing I'd like to talk to you about before we go to questions, and that is, we've talked a lot about individual memory, but actually there's a lot around cultural memory. You talked about it, and you said also about the pandemic, and also sort of world events that happen. But also, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about, in terms of refugees, displaced people, or people whose cultural experiences tend to get denied by the mainstream. So that kind of collective memory that maybe prefers one side of the story to another.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that I've done some interdisciplinary research, and one of the things we did was we went with Claire to an island off of the UK. It's a tiny island and nobody lives there anymore. But up until 1930, and going right back to prehistoric times, there was a group of people who lived there. They got evacuated overnight. Their story of that island has now been owned by everybody else. So there have been 200 books written about this, and only 2 of those are written by people who were actually there at the time. And Claire, interestingly, as an individual, was really upset about this. She said that you are denying these people their history. You know, you're taking away from them their personal history. And she always says that the thing that is most upsetting to her is not just not knowing her history, but it's everybody else telling her what her history is. And this, I think, happens in many circumstances where people can be separated from their cultural history. They may carry trauma that is maybe passed on to them, you know, through their parents' experiences that then get passed on to them, so they react and respond to things in a particular way without knowing the history of why that is. So take as a really simple, basic example that if you have a phobia for a spider, but that you remember something happening to you when you were younger with this spider, you kind of go, well, that's okay, I know why I'm having this reaction to it. But if there's stuff in your history and in your collective cultural history that is either relentlessly denied or covered up or taken away or just removed from the curriculum or from, you know, from where you learn, then you don't have the history that makes you who you are. And I think that kind of, well, we call it a cultural amnesia, and that amnesia for a group is just as significant as Claire's amnesia is for her as an individual. You just need to take her story and spread it across the culture to realize how significant and important it is to deny people their history. And it also means that when people do migrate or do move somewhere else, particularly as a refugee when they don't have the choice, or into a care setting, that allowing them to take some of their life with them is actually really, really important.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like the compassionate thing to do, doesn't it? And be really open to other people's version of what we might think of as history. Thank you so much. I'd love to take it over to questions. That man's got his hand up straight away, so we'll go to him. Thank you, he's just on the steps. But please do ask Cathrine your questions. And thank you for running around with the microphone. We appreciate it.
Thanks. The name is Matt. First of all, thank you for bringing this beautiful but very complex topic. You mentioned that there are various manifestations of memory via senses. For example, we have muscle memory, we have phantom pain after amputation, and also the research suggests that some character traits might be inherited via DNA. So my question is, what's your take on the embodiment of the memory? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, and it's one that I think creates quite a lot of controversy. The idea that things are passed down through DNA, sort of through generations, epigenetic kind of changes. I think, well, first of all, I think it's entirely possible for trauma, for example, to be passed down through generations. But I think that, first of all, there's a really obvious way in which that happens, which is that if an entire group, community, or a group of any kind is experiencing a particularly traumatic episode, then that trauma becomes part of the way they react to life. And then if they have children, they will carry some of those fears and some of that trauma in the way that they respond, the things that maybe they're scared of, their responses and reactions to particular things. So I absolutely think at a very basic level that intergenerational trauma is a real thing. I think it's much harder to examine the science of how this happens. I have seen studies with flies, with fruit flies, where they get one generation and they make them fearful about a particular thing, and then they show that the next generation down, who've had no contact, are showing a similar kind of response. But as far as I know, the reliable science has only been done on things like fruit flies so far. So I remain sort of healthily skeptical, but very interested in the way in which and the mechanisms by which that could happen. But I absolutely 100% support the concept of intergenerational trauma.
Thank you. We have someone in the front row here. Thank you. And we've had such great questions in all of our sessions, so thank you so much for those.
Thank you, Cathrine, very much for coming here and sharing. First, I would like to reassure, if I understood the story of Claire, that she still keeps her memories, but only the part of retaining them is broken, and she cannot approach them. And then my question is if there's any evidence or your experience with offering or kind of helping people get to subconscious level of their consciousness, and if there is any effect of that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Claire, yes, so she has knowledge about her life, but she can't reactivate many memories. She can a few, but not very many. I think the first thing to say, which I didn't mention, is that we have been quite successful in using techniques to help her to build new memories. And we have done this by getting her to wear a small camera, which takes pictures every 20 seconds or so. And if she then looks at the pictures again that evening and again the next day, we can sort of reactivate her memory and help her to make new memories. For all of us, we forget most of what happens to us. No one wants to think that, but we forget most of, consciously anyway, we forget most of what happens to us. But every time, you know, when you're wandering around or you get on the tram to go back or you just dozing off to sleep or doing something, your brain is replaying little sections of what happened, and in replaying them, you are basically revising your life just as you revise for exams. And what we've tried to do with Claire is to kind of make that happen in a way that it's not spontaneously happening for her. In terms of accessing people's unconscious memories, I think that is something that is more done by therapists, so it's not something that I actively do as part of my work. But what we do try to do is measure people's unconscious memories, and there are many techniques we have for doing that. You can do things like, if you were to take some key words, let's say, we'll stick with this idea of a spider phobia. If you give people the word spider and another word that looks a bit like spider, and you say, is this a word or not a word? And they just have to click, is it a word or not a word, as quickly as they can. And some of them are words and some of them are not words. The words that are meaningful to them and important, they will respond much quicker. And so there are lots of techniques like that where we can show that people have an implicit unconscious memory. There's many, many techniques that will allow us to measure the way that someone's past experiences is affecting the way that they behave now without them really knowing it. So we can test it in the lab, but I don't do it with individuals. I think that's for the therapists.
Thank you. Do we have some more questions for Cathrine? Yes, at the back there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's really interesting, you're talking about how important memory is for our identity and how emotionally important it is, but then you're also saying about how actually unreliable a lot of our memories are. Do you find that people are disturbed to sort of like learn that a lot of their cherished memories may not be as accurate as they think they are? And do you think they should be disturbed? Or does it matter less than we think?
That's such a good question. As people are always a bit disturbed to hear that, and I think that's healthy, because I think we kind of need to feel like our memories are telling us the truth, and you know, to a large extent they are. Sometimes one person's memory will be different from another person's memory because they viewed it from a different perspective. They had different knowledge when they experienced that thing, or they were literally at a different end of the room. You know, that people can remember things differently for those reasons. But I think where it's important for identity is that we hang on to the bits that are meaningful to us and we let go of the bits that aren't, and we kind of fill those bits in. So largely I would argue that we are hanging on to the bit that matters, and the stuff that we kind of make up is the stuff that just sort of probably doesn't matter so much. And if we choose to slightly reframe something, I mean, reframing is a positive thing to do a lot of the time. And I think it was mentioned yesterday by somebody, or maybe the day before, about as we get older, often we have more positive memories. So we tend to view things more positively as we get older anyway. So we get better and better at hanging on to the good stuff and letting go of the bad stuff. And we have reframed it and we have reshaped it. And that's generally a good thing. But you are right that when people are suddenly faced with, you know, if people go back and they find an old diary or something, they find some objective evidence that something was completely different to the way they've remembered it. It can be quite disconcerting. In fact, you had an example yesterday, didn't you, Juliet?
Yeah, so when I was traveling when I was about 19, I went to Florence, and there's Michelangelo's David statue. And when we got the photos back, because it was like taking them on your phones, we got them back and I was like, to my boyfriend, why did you take that picture? Like, you've chopped David's head off. And he said, I didn't take that picture. And I said, you did. I was like, I would never take a picture that bad, like chop like David's head off. And then he went, well, who's that in the picture? And it was him in the photo. So clearly I'd taken the photograph. So that's totally me thinking, having a false inflation of my photographic ability.
So it's disconcerting, but I mean, mostly I guess it's fairly trivial. The one thing that I would say that I think is really important, I actually think this is a relationship-saving bit of information, is that, and I don't just mean husbands and wives and partners, I mean even family members and all sorts of other friends, that sometimes you can absolutely vehemently, like really strongly disagree on how and when or what actually happened. So you will both have a different remembered experience, and both of you will be utterly convinced that your memory of it is right. And actually, the most healthy thing you can do is to recognize that it is possible that something that feels like a really, really strong memory can still be wrong. And we know this because in time and time again, we show this in research. And so one of the kind of best ways to deal with that situation is to kind of step back and go, okay, this memory, this version of events feels really, really true to me. But unless I can get absolutely objective confirmation, then I have to accept it's possible that something about what I'm remembering is wrong. Quite often it might be some mixture, some version of both of those events. And also you can do that thing where you can flip between one reality and another. We had a situation where our car had been given a speeding fine. It was doing 24 miles an hour in a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. I wasn't doing anything crazy. One of us wasn't. But the point was we just could not remember which of us had been driving the car. And it didn't matter. At 1 minute you kind of go, oh no, it's definitely me. And then you can, oh no, it was definitely somebody else. And actually for me, the most freeing thing has been able to accept that sometimes something I remember really strongly might just not be true.
Yeah, you really helped me let go of a dispute between me and my friend, an unspoken dispute about who was right about recalling a conversation, but I realised it doesn't matter. So that was really helpful. Are there any more questions? I can ask another. Oh, there is. Fab. Hello. We've got two more. Fantastic. One there, please, and one there. So should we go to you can go nearer first. Okay.
Hello, thank you. My question is rather simple. You talk about the identity of the person, and you touched slightly on the identity of the family or so. So my question is, can that be extrapolated onto something like an identity of a nation, and to what extent it can be, and to what extent it's a social construct? Because we are all part of nation and impacted through our lifetime through that.
Yes, I think it's a really brilliant question, and yes, I do think it can be exploited. I mean, if anyone's read George Orwell's 1984, then you'll kind of know the extreme version of what it can be to kind of shape a nation's identity by altering or changing or shaping what the history is. There are lots of interesting ways in which this can happen. There was when Trump had that expression, "Make America Great Again," there was an experiment done at that time where they went and asked Americans, when was great? When was great? And not in a sarcastic way, this was a genuine question. And actually what was interesting is that most people chose a time in their life when they were about 15 or 16. So everyone's version of when was great was completely different. And what was fascinating about that campaign is that it allowed everybody else to have their own reality of when it was great, and for that slogan to still work. But I think on a very serious level, I think that absolutely identity can be shaped by what you see in the media, what you see most importantly in your social media. So, if your social media constructs a history or constructs a version of events and that becomes reinforced over and over again, absolutely, we build this into who we are, as an individual, but who we are as a nation as well. So I think it's why misinformation is one reason why it's so important, and it's also a reason why we need to make sure that people have as broader kind of access to information and history as possible.
Thank you. I'd love to come to this last question, but we only have a couple of minutes, but please do ask your question.
Thank you. Hello, Cathrine. As you were speaking about music and memory, I have a question, because when I was a kid and a teenager, I was playing the piano, and when I had to perform in public, I was very much nervous, so I had a tendency to forget the music notes, even though I knew it very well before. On the other hand, there are people who can just hear the melody or the song on the radio, and they are just capable to play on the instrument right away. So is it related more to a talent, because they are so talented that they are capable to do that? Or is it more, or anyhow related to memory, and which kind of memory is it? Thank you.
Yeah, I know I've only got like a very short amount of time to answer this question, so I'm happy to chat with you afterwards. But the short answer is that memory for music is kind of almost as complex in that. So I don't think it's just one skill that people get. We know that certain things like pitch, remembered pitch, is genetically stronger in some people than others, but there's many other factors. Anxiety is a huge factor in whether you're going to remember something. Being able to play by ear, some of that is being done sort of by the cerebellum as a kind of almost procedural automatic memory. Some of it's being done, you know, triggered by emotion centers in the brain, and there's all sorts of areas of the brain that are important for music, and different people will have different strengths in those different areas. So that's a kind of very, very short answer to something that I've written a whole book chapter about. So that, I think being able to do that in less than a minute was probably as good as I can do.
Yeah, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to promote to the audience, or let the audience know about that you're working on?
No, everyone keeps asking me when I'm going to write a book, and I have 2 books in my brain. I just need to put them on the page. So in about a year's time, just kind of keep your eye on my name or my social media, and you hopefully will see the book that will come from all of this.
And we know it'll be brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone at Melting Pot Forum for being so wonderful and supporting us. Thank you to the audience, and a massive thank you to Professor Cathrine Loveday. Thank you so much. Thank you, Cathrine. And enjoy the rest of your festival. Také.